Hello everyone, I'm Schmidt from Rocket Lasso, and thank you for joining me today. My presentation is called Exploring Parts of Cinema 4D That You've Never Used Before, which was the secret title because we're going to actually be talking about S24 and a bunch of its new features. We do not have time to go into all of the new features, so be sure to check out my video where I cover even more of this content. But there's so much to do and we don't have much time, so let's jump right into just a quick heads up about what I do, which is that Rocket Lasso creates plugins and live streams and tutorials. There's a new rocketlasso.com to go and check out where we've got a bunch of things. A good one to check out is the community page where you can join the Slack, and there's lots of people doing cool community contests and challenges. And then make sure that you follow on Rocket Lasso on YouTube, where I've got tutorials coming out. I do live streams and just good stuff all around. But that's enough about me. We don't have any time to spare, so let's move into Cinema 4D S24. First up is some interface and viewport settings. The first thing to note about S24 is that it is S24, meaning that this is a subscription release, one of those half-year releases that they've been doing lately, meaning if you have a subscription, then you will get this version. The next thing to notice is some changes in the interface, a couple of tweaks. Mainly, a lot of these menu items are no longer left justified, but instead there are clusters of icons, which personally I kind of like them being broken apart. It makes it really easy to see the different clusters and find the object that I'm looking for. Also, the toolbar has been separated out from the timeline playback bar, and those are separated now and also center justified. So just a couple interface tweaks there. Next, I'd like to chat about a couple of changes inside of the viewport. Open up this scene file, and if you own Redshift, and if you have it installed, it has been integrated into the interface in a bunch of different places. Specifically here in the viewport, you can see there's a Redshift dropdown with Start IPR and the AOVs, a bunch of different options that are relevant in the viewport. Next up, you'll see we get these black bars left and right. Those are the safe frames. We've always been able to get rid of those by going into the viewport settings and finding them. But now in the options dropdown, there's a checkbox for safe frames. So really easy to turn that on and off. Really tiny thing, but I think that's pretty useful. It's one of the first things I always do is turn that off. Next up is, we've had this in a couple versions of Cinema, but under the filters, we can turn on and off different filters, and under presets, we can save a new preset or change it to something like the animation mode, which will hide the grid and the horizon line and the axis. A bunch of things I like turning off because I like the viewport being very clean. However, if we go back to defaults, we got all the stuff turned on. Under filter, there's a new geometry only playback. Now we've had geometry only since the previous version, but now with geometry only on playback, this is for doing animations, meaning while I'm working, I can have my grid and horizon and axis and all that. But as soon as I hit play, all of that will disappear and I'm just seeing the animation. I'm only seeing the geometry. So that can be really handy for when you're doing character animation. You can get all your interface elements, but then upon hitting play, you'll only see the relevant geometry. Next up, let's rewind there. Next up is, this is a common thing I would see with students a lot when I was teaching. Not knowing exactly where you're placing your object. So creating a new cube, hitting T for scale, scale it down. Let's say I wanted to put this cube directly on top of the sphere. Now, if you've been using 3D for a while, obviously you know different processes to do, but it was very common to see people try and move something over and be like, okay, that is now on top of the sphere. But obviously if we rotate our camera around, it is nowhere near the sphere. Now, there is a pretty handy option. Under options, there is now shadow hinting. If I turn that on, I can now grab this cube and move it around. And you're going to see a cast shadow coming straight down from the top, as if there's an infinite light up there. And now I could move this and I can be pretty sure I'm directly over this sphere and scoot this down. And now I can see what the placement is pretty well. So a nice little handy tool to add on to the list. Next, the first main feature I would like to talk about from S24 is the asset browser. The asset browser is the replacement to the content browser, and I am enjoying this quite a bit. The button for the asset browser is right here in the top of the main bar, real easy to find. And clicking that will pop open this menu. It eats up a whole bunch of the interface, but what I like is with this button very centralized and this menu just appearing right here in the center, it makes it very easy to get into it, find exactly what you want, and then get out of it. Where the old content browser, it ate up a lot of space. It was harder to navigate. I'm just finding this one a lot more intuitive. Now, inside of the actual asset browser, we have pretty much every single thing that's in Cinema is stored within this. So we've got the all category, objects, materials, media, nodes, and this is the scene nodes, the operators, and scene files. Now, if you had been using past versions of Cinema, then you know in the content browser that there are a bunch of downloads that you could do that were gigs and gigs worth of content, but you had to download all of it and have it all stored on your hard drive the entire time. Now, however, going into, let's say, the Object tab, we can see we've got all these different objects inside of Cinema, and if we click on any one of them, we can click on Packaging, and we can see a whole bunch of different packaging objects. Clicking on the tools, and we can see a bunch of tools. Click on, let's do fruits and vegetables, and you can see them start to load in. The reason that they're loading in like that is this is actually pinging the Maxon server, and it's showing what is currently in this big collection. And they do not exist in your hard drive anymore. They exist in the cloud. So let's jump over to something like, let's go to music, and inside of music, let's grab the cowbell, drag that into the viewport, or I could drag that into the object manager, and it's going to download that from the cloud and then add that object into our scene file. And now it's just there. Now that is stored on the computer, but we didn't have to have everything pre-downloaded. They're already there existing. I'm finding that the new asset browser is just a lot more intuitive, and it's really clean. That was something that bugged me in the content browser, is that I didn't use it that often because you had to kind of fight with the interface. But here, everything looks very clean, very simple. We got a couple different interface elements we can play with here. We can view these as icons, and I can increase or decrease the list. We can view them as a list and increase or decrease. Personally, I kind of like shrinking it really tiny. You can see as many as you can, but it's really handy to see these as icons. And then if we want more detail, up here, there is a Details tab. So we can click on this, and it's going to pop open this little extra bit of information. And this is telling us tons of things about the model. Here's the version, but under Info, I can see the name of the object, the type, size, date, the database, annotations with the information who might have put it together, Cinema 4D version. And then going to the Dependencies tab, we can get a list of everything that is linked from other places on your hard drive. So in this case, a bunch of different images were brought in, but if you were using a third-party renderer and had those materials, this would be calling out Octane or Redshift. If you were using plugins inside the scene file, it would be listing those as dependencies. And then things get even more interesting in the keywords, because they have gone and put a bunch of metadata on all the different objects. But we have the ability to add our own on top of that. So in this case, I already did this in the test. So here is instrument. I just want to add the word instrument to the assigned keywords. And now we have audio, metal, music, instrument, and of course, because that was the cowbell, cowbell is also involved in that as well. Using all this metadata and the keywords, up here we have a search bar, and searching for the word music, we can see all the different music items appear here. And only in the object tab, if we were to go to the all tab and search music, then we might find other things in other categories. So here's category of music. But if we searched for something like metal, then we're going to get C4D objects that involve metal. But if we scroll down further, this will have objects that have metal in them. But if we scroll down further, then we're going to get images that involve it, and every single different category. So we find materials that are labeled metal, objects that are labeled metal. I don't think there's any nodes labeled metal, but you can see how all the different categories can pop up. So very clean and organized. Search for another word. Let's do plant. And we've got a list of a bunch of different plants here. I could say, you know what? I really like that one. I can click this heart button and set that as a favorite, and that as a favorite, and that as a favorite. And those can be a bunch of my favorite plants there. If I clear out my search, up in the all category, we have quick access. And in there's a favorites folder, and everything that I've put the heart on, everything I've favorited, is going to appear in that folder. And I could click those hearts and get rid of those from the list. Also, let's search back for plant again, and I want to see plant objects. And let's scroll down and open up a new scene file. And how about dragging in a palm tree and another palm tree? So I've got two different palm trees dragged in. And my reason for doing that is I want to show you some of the advanced search options. So we're searching for all the plants right now, but let's say that I just want to search for palm. So now there's a bunch of palm trees that are involved, but I don't want to see all the palm trees. I just want to see ones I've already used before. And let's say I was in a new scene file. So I want to see palm trees, and I want to see ones that I've used. If I click on this drop down here, we have a bunch of additional search terminology, everything from name, size, type, date created, last used. keywords, like there's all sorts of options here. If we click on any of them, and in this case, I would like to use use count, you can see it's adding use count to this list. So we got Palm and use count, and I would like to see anything that I've used greater than or equal to 1. And now I am seeing a list of any palm tree that I've used at least once. We could say more than 10 times. You can have a list of automatic favorite objects. Now that I've got this more advanced search of palm and user count greater than 1, click on that drop down again for search terms, and at the bottom there is a save as smart search. If I click on that, we can name this to fave palm trees, give that a save, and now clear out our search under all. There is now under quick access a fave palm trees, and at any given point I can click on that and it will be populated by everything that meets that search criteria. So being able to do an advanced search but then save that search is really handy, and I think I'm going to end up using that a lot. Let's talk about bringing objects into the assets browser. If I go to Window and pop open the content browser now labeled Legacy, I can pop that open, and I've got some presets added in here. These are library files I downloaded from third parties, and in this case I've got some Happy Toolbox models. So I could go into this tree pack and you see all these different tree models, and there's some nice thumbnails associated with them. Well, if I were to right click on that entire tree pack, there is now a Convert to Assets button. If I just click on that and say, yes, I'd like to save this to preferences, or you could create a new location, say create new database. I've got a custom one I made already on a hard drive somewhere called Asset Browser. Click OK. It's exporting the entire thing. It is now exported, 0 errors. Close this. And now inside of our asset browser, I can scroll down. Actually, let's go to all. There is now a converted category. Inside of there is our Happy Toolbox models, all of these trees, and they're ready to be placed wherever we want to. So these are models. I would like to drop them inside of the objects folder. So I'll just drag them up there. And now inside of all of my objects, here are those trees in their own folder, and they even brought those thumbnails over. Now selecting these trees, they don't have any assigned keywords. So I could just select all of them and say, I would like to add in the word tree. And there's tree already inside of our assignable keywords. Add that. Let's search for the word plant, and we'll add that in as well. And how about making a new one? I'll say Happy Toolbox, and I would like to add that in as a brand new one. It wants to save this as a new term. I'll save that into the preferences, and now that gets saved as well. And these are all marked. So when I search for the word tree, then these will be mixed in as well. I've just added them into the category, and it's working really quickly, and it's such a smooth workflow that I can actually see myself using this to stay extra organized. So that was converting a library pack that I already had. How about adding in some brand new models? Let's clear this all out, and under objects, I would like to start adding in a brand new category. Select nothing here in the asset browser, and then drag in a scene file I made, and we'll be seeing more of these in a little bit. But for now, these are some reasonably low poly noodle models with a good amount of detail, and I would like to make some assets out of this. So under the Object tab, how about I create a new folder, right-click on Objects, and create a new category, and this will just be noodles. Hit OK, and now I have a noodles folder. Inside of there, it's empty, but I can now drag each one of these models directly into the content browser, and yes, I would just like it to be each of these noodles is going to take on the name, and you'll see as I drag them in that each one becomes a separate model. It's creating an individual render for it, and I believe I can even select the 3 remaining models, drag them in, and because each one of them is a separate model, they will each be brought in as their own standalone object. Now it's important to note that Cinema is automatically picking a particular angle and rendering it from that direction. And there's no lighting or anything, so it's just this straight up model. That's the preview you get. But you know, it's clean. There's no grid lines or anything, and that is the preview that you can get. But let's say you did want to get fancier and you have a, let's say this little piece of spaghetti, which is really just a cylinder. Let's open up a new file, and I would like to drag this in. Hit S to zoom up on it, and let's just get a slightly more interesting angle on it. Not much, and actually it's going to render square, so immediately I'll go into my render settings. Set this to be a square image, so we can now see how that's going to be framed, and I just want to get a little bit better of a perspective on this. So angling it like so, it's going to come at the camera a little bit. Nothing terribly fancy, but going into the renderer, I could say, okay, do that as a viewport renderer. Let's set this to be geometry only. Send that out to the picture viewer. And now I've got this image. Right-clicking, actually, let's go Edit, Copy, and I've copied that image. And then going into the spaghetti, I can right-click on its image and say, Update Preview from Clipboard. So that's why I copied and pasted in. And now I get that new image that might be a little more clear of what it's supposed to be. That could be a JPEG from your desktop. When you right-click, you can see you've got all these different options. I could say Generate Preview, and it'll just make it again from scratch. But that's how you change the image. Now I've got all these different noodles. How about selecting all of them? And I will assign the word noodle to them and add that tag. Add it to preferences. I would like to add in the word pasta. We'll put that in for the search. So now they all will be searched for by their name, but also pasta and also noodle. So at any given point, I can be in this big old menu and say, I want to find pasta. And even before I finish typing it in, you can see those start to fill up. And look, there's even a pasta scoop and some pasta tongs. So it's all right there, ready to be used, really organized. Moving on, let's close the asset browser and check out Place and Scatter. This scene file is from my vacuum form anything tutorial, which I think is pretty cool. You should go check it out. Here we take a ridiculous model like a stegosaurus and get a pretty nice vacuum form effect from it. So definitely check that out. But here we are in the scene file, and I would like to add a couple extra details onto this electronics panel. Go back into the asset browser, and this time let's search for the word bolt. And here's some like hardware. I would like to put some screws on here to look like they're holding this control panel on. So we've got these bolts. If I right click, another feature inside the asset browser is reveal in browser. And that will actually navigate us to this objects folder where we can see a bunch of different screws and nuts and bolts. So in this case, I would like to take this hex cap and start placing it on the panel. So I will click on the place tool here and drag the hex cap into the scene, and immediately you can see it's going to put a little preview of it there. I let go and it has placed it on the surface. There's a couple of different widgets on here. I can select this first one and spin it around. I can select this middle control and scale it. And if I hold down Control, I can create a duplicate of this object and place it over here. And create another duplicate and place it there. Let's spin that one around a bit and go to place this last one on this corner. So yeah, really quick to place those individually. We could change the scale. There is a couple of different options inside the place tool. The defaults work really well, but by default, it's looking at the bounding box of the object that we're bringing in and copying. So it should always lay flat on the ground or the surface. Its orientation is based on the normal of the object we're colliding with. And then the up direction, Y positive is obviously a good default. We can offset it from the surface. And then we have prevent collision. I'll show you that in a second. And then clone mode, where as I'm holding down Control to make copies, it's creating instances of it. But we could also create render instances or just straight up copies of the geometry. But turning on this prevent collision, let's make one more copy of this. And you'll see as I try and drag this around, it's going to stop me from bumping into these other objects. And I do believe that also has a little, it has an effect on the scale as well. So we can't scale past that reasonable amount where it would start colliding with other objects. So just the basic placement here is really, really nice. Let's go and add some other objects. Let's put a hat on our stegosaurus. Drag in a party hat into the scene, and I would like to place that here. Let's just let it exist. And now we got a giant hat. I would like to scale that down. And again, this is seeing the bounding box, so it's pivoting from that correct spot. Now that we got the smaller hat, I can just click and drag around, and anywhere on this incredibly high poly model is going to place it on the normal. And this is kind of like using a bunch of very specific snapping tools, but we don't have to set them up. They're just, the defaults are working great here. We've now placed that. Let's search for potted, and here's some potted plants. So I'll grab this jade plant, and I can preview that right here. Let go. It'll actually load it in the scene. There it is. Change the scale if I'm inclined. Hold down Control. Make a duplicate of it. Make this one larger, and spin it around a bit. And you can see how quick it will be to copy objects, place them around the scene, get them exactly where you want. And it is very sensitive as well. If I were to select, and I didn't even have to hold down the button. If I just single click, it selected this object. And now holding that Control, I make that duplicate of it. And as I drag it, you'll actually see it's going to be, let me turn off collision. As I move this around, you can see it'll travel very specifically along the surface. You can even see it follow the curvature on the edge, jumping to each angle, place it right there. and scale it down. Now we've got a different size, and the copies, of course, will always be based on the previous one. So I can put 2 bolts right there very, very quickly. So I really like the place tool just as a quick go-to for getting things layered in your scene without having to put too much thought into it. Next, to show the scatter tool, let's turn off the asset browser and open up a different scene file. This is a little character animation I had been putting together. Hit play and we check it out. My little character Speedy. Pew! Gotta finish this up one of these days, but we are not concerned with this character though. We are concerned with the environment. We've got a big old lonely desert road, this valley, these hills, some boulders, and just a single tumbleweed for decoration. Let's say we want a bunch more tumbleweeds. That is where the scatter tool comes in. Selecting the tumbleweed, going to the drop down with the place tool, we also have the scatter pen. And without changing any of the settings, let's begin to paint on the ground here, and you can see a series of white circles, red circles, and then tumbleweeds are getting created. So let's break this down one step at a time. How is it placing these? Well, the red circle is the object spacing. What it's doing is it kind of a circular bounding box, and then it's adding 20 units. So if we want these to be a little bit closer together, I could hit undo, and instead say, let's say -20. So now, as I paint them, the red circles are smaller, meaning the plants can be closer together and possibly the branches could intermingle a little bit. Next up are these white circles, and these are the splats. Currently we're in splat mode, and the splat size is currently, the radius is 20. Hitting undo, let's make the radius really big, and now, a little too big. Now you see I have a large circle, and every time I click and drag, let me get a better perspective here. Every time that I drag, you can see it's generating 10 tumbleweeds. So that is because we have a count of 10. And you'll notice as I drag that another circle can't be created until the first one has moved the width of the circle. So what that means is the radius is the set size where 10 units will be created. And then the splat spacing is the spacing in between the circles. So if we put extra spacing here and I click and drag, then now you see there's a gap in between each one. We can put a negative number in there. Let's say -100. And those can now get closer together where a new circle is generated before the previous one. That's using splat mode. We can increase the count, crank that way up. And now there will be 45 getting created in each one, assuming that there's enough space for every red circle. Putting that back to default, lowering the count back down again. I actually prefer to use density mode, which we can turn off splats, and now we're in density mode. And at 2%, let's go up a little bit higher. Now, as I click and drag, you see it's going to be constantly generating the white circle and thus constantly trying to create 10 more tumbleweeds. Lowering this amount down to something small like 2%. As I drag, it's only creating a couple per circle, meaning this is a really nice way of generating just a handful in a spot and then staying in one spot and really filling it up with a whole bunch of the tumbleweeds. So a lot of power just inside of that. But right now they're a little bit uniform. The direction of the tumbleweeds is going to be whatever direction I was dragging at the time. But if we scroll down in the Object tab, we can see that there's some variation that we can add. It's under the Transform tab. And I want to add no position variation. That would be weird here. But I do want some random rotation. So I want up to 15 degrees on X. And let's spin up to 360 degrees on Y. And on Z, let's do another 15 degrees for it to be able to tilt. And then the scaling, min and max, let's lower this as small as, let's say, 65 and as large as 155% of the scale. So now, when I paint, we're going to get smaller and larger tumbleweeds filling in the space, and they're all randomly rotated. And even with a single object, that will give you a lot of variation. So you see that's all getting filled up quite nicely. Now, when it comes to the placement of these, it is going to attempt to place it on every single object in the scene that is currently visible. That's why I hid the robot, because it would be trying to place it on the more complex robot, and I don't want that. But you'll see that we have these boulders, which are not terribly high poly, but overall the scene does have a pretty significant number of polygons. If I were to start painting, let's make a larger circle, I can just click my middle mouse button as a button and drag to increase the radius. I can begin to generate a whole bunch of these tumbleweeds and place them also on the top of these rocks. And at any point I could let go and begin drawing a new stroke here with a series of circles generating as well. And it still won't collide with those previous ones because they're all being generated inside this scatter object. So I can click one time and see the end result of all of those getting placed. So that is actually working quite nicely. That is a ton of tumbleweeds and it's running quite quickly. Although, let's delete that scatter object and start again because I'd like a little more variation. And along those lines, how about we unhide the robot, open up our asset browser and search for the word grass. And here's a bunch of different grass. Click on the object tab, so we're only seeing objects. And you can see there's a bunch of different grass models that come inside of Cinema by default. And there's a bunch of dry grass models. That's what I want. So let's add the word dry. So here's just the dry grass. Selecting all those, right click and load them into my scene. Hang on, I'm going to click on the move tool so it runs quickly. So it's not trying to calculate the character. Selecting the dry grass, you can see that it's underground right now. It's really small, so I'm going to hit T for scale, scale it up until, it's kind of the size of the tumbleweed, just so we can fill it up based on the size of this character. And I'll even scoot them over, but the placement doesn't matter. Now, selecting all of those objects, we can go back. Let's hide the character. Go back to the scatter tool, and what we have been doing is using the selection. Whatever is currently selected, that's what's going to get placed. But instead, let's this time use the object palette. So let's hit lock for just a moment so I can select all these objects, drag them in, and then unlock it. So this is now the palette of objects we are going to be drawing with. And specifically, what's cool about this is we can now type in a frequency. Let's say that the tumbleweeds, they're going to call a lot of attention to themselves in comparison to what the dry grass is. So let's make it so that there are 2 of that type and 3 of that type. We'll do 4 of that type. Oop, not 41. 4 of that type. 1 is fine. 2 and 3. So now those are way more likely to happen than the tumbleweed just as a ratio. So now using the scatter tool, I could, it's a little bit large right now, so let's shrink that up a bit and begin to paint. And you can see that it's going to be scattering out those units of grass and the object, and the different red circle sizes are based on, the size of the original object based on our modifications. So those can all overlap a little bit, which is what I want. And I was really surprised that this works as well as it does. Increasing my circle size a bit, I'm going to, from this crazy long far away perspective, just begin to paint a whole bunch of these. And I'm going to be painting them on the surface of these hills all the way down the road, just randomly placing a bunch of them all over the place, really just going nuts with the placement. And then click one more time so that refreshes. And you see that I have placed a ton of these all over the entire environment. So I could zoom up at any point, give that a spin, and click and draw some more. Looks like I got some sort of viewport artifact there, but ignoring that, you can see that a whole bunch of these are getting placed everywhere, and it still runs incredibly quickly. So yeah, the scatter tool is very, very powerful. Going back to the move tool so that we don't take time calculating the character, I'm going to turn him back on again, and you'll see, even in spite of adding in all of those objects, you can see that we haven't really taken any kind of a hit in our playback speed. And the character is still ready to rock and run really, really quickly. Pew! Next up is the dynamic place tool. This one is a lot of fun. Dragging in another scene file. Here is a jar, a lid, a ground disk, and a redshift light. I've got redshift installed, and if I hit render view, you can see this is all just set up with some basic lighting and stuff for us to interact with. What I would like to do is take the lid off of this jar and fill it with a bunch of the noodles that we put in the asset browser earlier. So if I want to take this lid off, we could just click and move, obviously. But now, how about we go to the dynamic place tool? And with the dynamic place tool, I can select the lid. And I'm only going to change one setting from default, which is going from 1 meter to 0.01, because I'm working at I'm real world scale, but we're way zoomed in on small objects. So I would like to pull this lid off, and we get this nice little gizmo. Just clicking anywhere in the viewport, I can drag it up, and you'll see it'll pop up off the object. It's got a little bit of a wiggle chasing behind where we've got the gizmo, and it'll actually collide with the model. So I can click and drag this down, and now it is leaning against the jar and against the ground. That would have been pretty difficult to do in the past, to manually rotate and place that exactly where we wanted it. But you see that actually works really, really well. Moving back into the asset browser, I can search for the word pasta because we put the keywords on there. Grab the pasta shell, hide the asset browser, back to the dynamic place tool. In fact, I want to hit E and move this out so it's not colliding already, and then go to dynamic placement, and the noodle will be bouncing around trapped inside that jar, working very nicely. But with that selected, how about going to the scatter pen tool and making a whole bunch of noodles? So I'll just start painting these around, make a whole bunch of them, and then make it editable, because we don't want to apply this dynamic stuff to the overall scatter. We want it to be on the individual objects. So making that editable, select all the instances and back to dynamic placement. I can now move these around, and you'll see they will collide with the floor, with the jar, with the lid, with each other, and these are being dynamically placed now. So let's look at some of the different options inside of the widget. Is it a widget or a gizmo? I'm not sure, but the first thing we can do is move it around, which you've seen, and then we can rotate it, and there's two different ways of rotating. We can rotate the overall group or the actual object. So if I rotate the object, it's not going to move them, but they'll all individually spin. And then we can also say both. Then we can scale, grabbing the X scale. You see I can scale these apart, and we can do it on Y and get a little separation from that. But my favorite is this new purple handle, and dragging that will scale them all in and out, kind of attracting them or pushing them away. So really handy for grouping all of these together. So in this case, how about pulling them all into the air, going to a top view, scooting them over the jar, and back to our 3D view. And let's just try and scoot those really close together, and then move them down into the jar. Excellent. Now, here's where things get really fun. If you hold down the Shift key as you drag, it will apply the gravity to it, and they'll all fall down to the bottom of this jar. That is a lot of fun and very intuitive. So if we don't like that placement, I could scale these out and they'll all push against the wall, hold down Shift and allow the gravity to take over again. We could scoot it up, just hold down Shift and let them fall again, slightly getting different placement, or even spinning them in the space, hold down Shift, and once again let them fall into the pile. Now we've got a bunch of those sitting in that position. How about duplicating all of them? And then E for move, I don't want the dynamic, and then back to dynamic, hold down Shift and drop them. And we'll do that again, selecting all of the instances. So we got a ton of these now. Hold down Control as I make a duplicate. E for move, scoot them up, hold down, well, back to dynamic place tool, hold down Shift and let them fall in dynamically. And now we got a bunch of them and they're all filling in the space. We can make any changes that we like, but there we go. That is now a filled up jar of noodles. I'm trying to imagine how I would have done that in the past. It wouldn't be very artistic. It would be making a bunch of clones of it and then running dynamics and hoping that you get a good look. But now at any point we can select any individual shell. Let's deselect all those. Select that one shell and we could scoot this up and we scoot it over dynamically, hold down Shift and let it fall in a different spot, and now we've placed it in a completely new area. Going back to the asset browser, I will select all the noodle types, right click and load them into the scene file. Hit E for move so I can scoot them all out from intersecting. And let's go and paint a bunch of these on again with the scatter tool. So back to scatter, make a whole bunch of noodles all over the place. Once again, making it editable so we can affect the actual children inside of it. And I'd like to select all those noodles and their original reference objects. Back to dynamic placement. And yeah, now it's just, fun. We can scoot these around, let them hit the ground. They'll fall over from some of the friction. They can bounce into the jar. We could scale them together so they're clustering up. But let's go and take a look at some of the different settings inside of the dynamic placement. Right now, we've got some friction. We've got a bunch of gravity, no bounciness. So if we were to hit Shift and let these fall, you're going to see they fall pretty gently. However, let's say that we have them all like really clustered together here, and I want them to spread out a bit. What I might do is pull them all up into the air and then give it a bunch of bounciness, hold down Shift as I drop them, and now they're really bouncy and you'll see them start wandering around. Let's do that again. Really let them bounce. And now you see them scatter all over the place. And then I'd stop, get rid of the bounciness, hold down Shift, and then let them settle in. So that was a way of spreading them out and getting, a little bit of extra chaos in the scene. In addition to that, we've got regular kind of world gravity on here, but if things are bouncing around too quickly, if they don't settle in, if they're passing through each other a bit, something I like doing is lowering the gravity to be relatively low. And now when I hold down Shift and drag, they will gently fall to the ground, and there's not going to be quite as much randomness happening. Everything gently falls. So a really quick and easy setting to change as well. And finally, we have the collider geometry, and Maxon put together a new algorithm that makes it so that, let's visualize, it makes it so that there are no concave shapes, only convex shapes, which makes it run really quickly. You see that it's made low poly proxies of all these different objects, and it's subdivided this jar into a bunch of flat faces. So if you wanted to, you could crank up the accuracy and the grouping, or you could lower it way down and make it run quicker. But 5 is a really good setting, as you see here. Cranking up to like 8 and 8 is pretty accurate. You could lower it down to 3, but it'll actually create this nice, fast, low poly geometry so it can do the collisions really, really quickly. Let's just have a little bit of fun here on the last bit let's go and shatter our jar here. I'll do that by selecting the jar, feeding it into a MoGraph Voronoi fracture. I'd like it to have a bunch of extra pieces, so select the distribution, crank that to 55. And then in object, I would like to stretch those pieces vertically, so give it a scale of 2. And now you can see each of these individual pieces, which are, complex geometry, and they're each being calculated based on our current dynamic placement settings. So as all of those calculate, they're getting their shape. I can now make this editable, and I would like to select, actually, let's open up the scatter, which is all the shells, and I'm going to select that top shell, and then scroll all the way down and select, actually expand the Voronoi fracture and select all the different pieces of that jar. And I do want all these things to be dynamic except for the null that contains all of them, otherwise they'll be treated as a group. So deselecting that one, I can hold down Shift and drag, like you can see the calculations wrapping up, and I can hold down Shift and drag, and the entire thing will shatter and fall to the ground and settle in. So as it gets to a more finalized state, I often let go. So it's like, okay, that's kind of locked in, and now more gently let them settle in. It just gives you an undo state if you want to. So yeah, look, I've shattered that jar really easily. All the different shells fell around it. Everything is placed very cleanly, and we can do it very artistically. All these pieces could be moved around or scattered or separated. Let's even take this, and there's a lot of axis here, but yeah, there's the purple line. Let's see if I can take these and spread them out a little bit. Yeah, we can spread them out, hold down Shift and let them fall. So even with all of this geometry, and these are not low poly objects, if I hit NB, take a look at how much geometry is involved in each of these shells. So you can see how all of those have been placed. We've now scattered it out. Let's move off the dynamic placement tool and just take a look at the end result of what we've got here. Collapsing in all the shells. I'd like to select them and just apply this pasta material. Apply. And then let's just do a quick render here, opening up Redshift. This came out. So we've now got all these noodles on the ground, shattered glass, really quick to put together, a lot more artistic to put together, but with all the power of simulation on top of it. Also, these noodle models are going to be available on the Rocket Lasso Patreon if you're interested in getting access to those as well. Close that down. The next tool is going to be really handy, and that is the new TWEEN tool. Now, to show this off, I've got some old characters I put together for Chicago C4D, and I end up using this character in a series of GSG tutorials. Here is a simplified version of the character. Now, we could do a way simplified version of this, but I figured let's go with the full treatment and do it with a character. And this is actually my preferred workflow for doing character animation. And that is, and I'm going to select all of his keyframes, that is, I have created all of his key poses here, and they're all just butted up against each other. There's no timing. I don't worry about timing at all. I just get pose to pose to pose to pose. And now I want to worry about the timing. Right now you're seeing all these animation lines, and that is the animation path where all the different objects are moving to, including like the elbow controls and the knee controls. So it's kind of a big mess. But remember, we've got that other new control under filter, which is geometry only playback, meaning if I hit play or even if I scrub, everything will disappear except for the geometry. And this is designed to work with animation. So when we hit play, all we see is what we need to see without all that stuff getting in the way. So there's no timing here, but we've got all of these key poses. And now I just want to put time in between them. Now, before we get really specific, just make sure that I have all my controls selected, which I did by I created a selection object. Double-clicking that will select all my character controllers. And I just want to put a bunch of time in between each of these. So selecting all the keyframes, I'll just drag it way out, and there's an arbitrary amount of time between every single keyframe. I'll just have it start at 0. All right. Then, now you can see that the character's got a bunch of timing, but he's going to be kind of moving very oddly because obviously there's not supposed to be an even amount of timing in between each one of these. So let's start using the new TWEEN tool, which you can find right here in your animation tools. And that's going to pop this open. First of all, I would like it to affect not just position, rotation, and scale, but also any parameters and user data, and why not? Let's say tags as well. And we can turn on the HUD, so it will show the interface up here in the HUD. So the first and most basic usage of this is the ability to tweak all of the selected objects, keyframes, forward or backward in time. So we've got this first pose where we're going from resting to the beginning of his anticipation for jumping. I would like a lot more time in there. So instead of dragging and selecting everything in the timeline, I could just have everything selected and hit this +1 button. But holding down Shift will mean everything ahead of this time will get moved forward. Let me show you. If I just hit +1 right now, you see the next keyframe is going to get scooted forward and backward. But if I hold down Shift and hit +1, then everything moves forward. And this is really nice. It's a great workflow. So in this case, he's going to take a while to go down to this anticipation pose. And then, now that he's here, he's going to move into this lower pose. That can probably be a little quicker. So I'll hold down Shift as I click -1. And then what's he doing here? He's going to be beginning is actually, this is kind of the hold of the pose. So we'll worry about that in a moment. And then he's starting to do his jump. That feels like it should happen pretty quickly. So holding that Shift, you can also see in this interface, we have our -1 and +1. So holding Shift, go minus, minus, minus. That should happen really quickly. And then he's going into this jump. That should also happen quickly. That's where he's gaining speed. So I'll say minus, minus, minus. Why not? And then he starts jumping. This is also feels like it should be pretty quick. So let's subtract at least 2 keyframes from there. And then going up here, now he's starting to settle out. So this should be quick, but not too quick. And then here, okay, now we're kind of getting into his hold pose up in the peak. So that's this section. And I think we should hold that for longer, so I'll add an extra frame. Over here, he's beginning to drop, and that should happen pretty quickly. So minus, minus, and then next up, this, pretty quick, I think. And here, now he's starting to settle. Should happen quick, but not too quick. And then finally here, okay, now he's starting to settle in, so I'll let that have some time. And then finally, him going into his final pose, and that should take a while. So if I wanted to move this ahead, not just by 1, but an arbitrary number, we've got set n, and here's our +n. So it's 5 frames. If I hold down Shift and click +n, it'll jump forward 5. So I click that 2 times, that'll push it up 10. And now we've got our basic retiming, so hitting play. Okay, that's definitely better than the basic one, but there's definitely a little bit of floatiness, so we'll make a couple extra tweaks in here. Moving here, and this is where the power of this really comes in, we can start adding in additional midpoint poses. So we're essentially building our in-betweens. So he's slowly bowing down in anticipation of his jump, but I feel like he'll take a while getting out of the settled pose. So going to, let's say, a midpoint here, I can, with everything still selected, drag this tween slider and watch, we got no keyframe right here, and I've got no auto keyframing turned on, but when I drag the slider and let go, instantly you see a new keyframe appears. In fact, every aspect of the position, rotation, scale, parameter, etc. is all going to be keyframed. But this is now a tween in between its previous pose and the next pose. So in this case, I want him to be almost entirely at -100. He's entirely in his previous pose, but I want him mostly in his previous pose. And then this should take a while to do this. So let's add a couple keyframes there. So now he's going to really take a while doing this initial movement and then start moving quicker towards the end. I would like him to hold this pose a bunch. So let's get another midpoint in there. I'll just drag this an arbitrary amount so it creates a new keyframe. Let's see, here he's moving into this pose. Here's where I really want him to hold. So let's add a couple extra frames of time in there. So he's transitioning into this pose. Maybe we get some extra time right there. Not holding Shift, hit +1 just to scoot that forward. So now he transitions here. He's going to hold that for a little while and then begin the jump. And actually, I'd like to scoot that forward. So now he's pausing in this pose and then shooting out of it really quickly. And then we start heading over here. And I like the look of this, but he's dropping right there. How about adding an extra frame? And then right here in the midpoint, I'd like his feet to stay up higher. I don't want them just transitioning perfectly in between those 2 poses. So at this midpoint, how about selecting just his 2 feet controls? And now I can go back to the tween tool. And what do I want these to look like at this time? Well, I want them to be way closer to where they had been before. Not all the way up, which seems extreme, but decently further up. So those are kind of doing a little more hang time. So now as I scrub through, you see his feet will just hang up there longer and wait for the body. And now they really slam down to the ground. And that's what I want to see out of that. And then similar to what we did in the beginning, where he's going to take a while getting to that pose, let's have him ease out of this pretty quickly. Let's see, he's doing that all right. Probably even speed that up a bit. Let's double click and select all the objects and say, Let's do a -1, -1. And then here, as he's getting out of his pose, I would like him to transition out of it relatively quickly. So going back to the tween, I'll pull him. Let's pull him most of the way out of it. Not all the way, but most of the way. So that creates a new keyframe. And now his final transition out will take longer. Let's add a couple extra frames on that one. So now we get the anticipation. He holds this pose, very quickly transitions out, travels upward, holds this one for a long time, and then begins falling. We change just the in-between of the feet, and he falls down, really hits that pose, absorbs the impact a little bit slower, transitions out of that animation, and then really slowly settles in. So rewinding, hitting play. Let's see what we got. Yeah, not too bad. I would definitely keep on making more tweaks there. There's a lot to add on. But keep in mind, we have not gone into the timeline at all. We haven't gone into the F-curves at all. But we're starting to really get a feel for the motion and the timing that we want this character to have. I mean, really, I'd like to add a bunch more punch here. This jump up, that should definitely be quicker. So I'll make that happen faster. Even right here on this transition, I want that to have more punch, so I'll make that go quicker. And really, a single frame here goes a long way. He's holding this upper pose nicely. I don't have a problem with that. This drop is, yeah, that's transitioning out pretty well. Maybe that one can be a little quicker. -1. And that's fine. I'll even have him pull this out earlier, so -1 without holding shift. And that, there, now he really eases out. Let's take a look at that. Excellent. Oh, yeah, there's a lot better punch in the height of that jump. So yeah, that is using the tween tool, going kind of full in on this being a character. Just to show you, this was spending just a little bit more time at building some more in-between poses. Rewind, hit play. So now he's got a little bit more in-betweens and transitions, but using all those exact same tools. So I will be using this a lot when it comes to my character animation, because it's just so intuitive to tweak the keyframes forward or backward, or be like, hey, I want to take this midpoint, this transitional pose, and tweak it closer to this keyframe or the following keyframe. And I'm just really excited to see those tools in Cinema now. So we'll give that a rewind and then take a look at, lastly, we've got Nodes and Scene Manager. Now, as always with these presentations, there's way too much to show, and now I'm in a big rush here at the very end. So if you're watching this live, I'm going to be doing a live show tomorrow on Rocket Lasso Live with Rick Barrett from Maxon, and we'll be talking a whole bunch about the new features. And next week, I'm going to have Casey Hupke on as a guest, and we'll be talking all about nodes. So we'll go into way more details then. But for now, I'm going to open up a scene file that I've been putting together over the last week. It is very, very important to note that this is not meant to be a tutorial on using scene nodes. This is something I've been building, and I just want to show you a couple of the cool new features. Like I said, we'll be going over this in a bunch more detail tomorrow and next week. Now, what is happening? Let's change the layout to nodes and drag it back from my other monitor. And here is a basic setup. What I'm doing is taking the object manager and I'm creating a loft from an end side. It's got a bunch of different sides right now. And that's being brought in. I'm modifying it a whole bunch, and essentially I'm randomizing the interior geometry, which means this is live, and I can do something like change it to 6 sides. And you'll see that is randomizing the interior geometry of that. In theory, I could feed any spline in here, and it's making that all crazy and randomized. And that is being fed into this scene root node, which we'll get more into in a little bit. And this is what is generating that. Now, there's actually a lot more than that going on, where I have nodes inside of nodes, each of them doing something different. And then we can go and zoom out, and I've got a lot more going on. But the end result of this is, let me show you. I'll drag the final scene root here to the end, and then feed this in. And it's going to take that geometry and modify it even more. And now I get a bunch of plots of land, some random rivers. There are a bunch of roads as well. There's bridges. And then we've got some different buildings I can output. First of all, let me show you. I've got this node. Doesn't matter how I did it. Right now, it's randomly taking in that randomized geometry, and it's outputting 4 randomized selections of it. So the first one is being fed into this building, and that can be output as well. And now here's a building type filling in those plots of land. Here is another building type, and it's outputting that. I would like for us to go and build a third type of building so we can plug that in and check it out. So in order to do that, how about going into the brand new Scene Manager? So it doesn't look like much right now, but we can open up the asset browser and then travel into the nodes tab here. So going from all to nodes, we now see the nodes layout. When I'm working with nodes, I really like going into list mode and shrinking them down so I can read as many names as possible. And we will only be touching the nodes involved with geometry for now. So here's the Scene Manager, and this is essentially a preview of what the replacement for the Object Manager. So this is very early on. It's going to change a bunch. This is still considered a tech demo, so it's not production ready yet, but you can start seeing some of the power of it. I would like to, let's even open up a new scene file. So brand new. And the only thing that we now have is a scene root node. Before, we used to have a big bar on the right side. It took up a whole bunch of space, but now it is a single node. And I like this way better. So using our Scene Manager, I'd like to begin with something. We essentially need a prototype spot for a building. In this case, let's go to Geometry Primitive and find a plane. And I can drag that into the Scene Manager. There it is, and here's its parameters, and you see it appeared here in the nodes. This Scene Manager is tied directly in with the nodes. So let's get the basic parameters. First of all, this is going to be huge because that city is built in real world scale. So let's do 20,000 in the width and the height, and I want 1 by 1 segments, zooming way out so we can see the overall shape. Excellent. Now, I would like to start modifying this. The first thing to do is select all the polygons. So going into geometry selection, I would like to, well, there is no select all right now. So how about grabbing a random selection and dragging that directly onto the plane, and it will now automatically add it into a stack. So this is now a modifier stack that's going to be affecting this plane. Selecting the random selection, I would like to randomly select, actually, yeah, we got random selection of all the polygons. Select them all, 100% chance of selecting them. And then, now that they're all selected, how about we subdivide? So under modifier, I would like to subdivide. I'll drag that in as the next modifier. Subdivide one time, hit NB so I can see the different polygons here. You see that there are now 4 polygons. How about another random selection? In fact, why don't we duplicate this first one? And now that's been duplicated, I would like a 75% chance of selecting the polygon. So hopefully we select 3 of them. And then how about modifying with an inset? So let's inset that. And now you do indeed see that 3 of our polygons were selected. So like I said, these are giant buildings. So let's do this based on percentage. So we can inset these up to, let's say, 35%. And I want a lot of variation, so I'll do 100% variation on that. So some are bigger, some are smaller. And then let's extrude. So extrude those all upward. Right now it's very tiny. Let's do an extrude of, let's say, 5,000. Yeah, that's actually a pretty good number. And lots of variation on that. Yeah, let's do about a 65% variation. Then what? How about another, actually, let's do, let's do another inset. And this time, yeah, that's pretty good. I'll do a bunch of variation. Let's do 150% variation this time. So some might actually push outward, and then duplicate the extrude. So that will happen a second time. And then we'll duplicate the inset and do another random inset. And then even copy the extrude one more time. But this time, let's have the extrude be up to 200%, but only initially go up and down about 500 units. So now it might push up a little bit and it might push down a little bit. But you see, we've got some very simple, basic buildings. And we might end up with 1, we might end up with 4, we might end up with 3 from all the random variation. So here they are represented as nodes. It's a mess right now because they all got piled on top of each other. But if we hit Shift L, it'll automatically organize all the nodes in the scene. And let's give ourselves a little more visual space here. And you can see that starts out and every single step along the lines is represented from here. So that's just a quick demo of the Scene Manager, but let's integrate this into the rest of our setup. So in that case, we know that we don't need this geometry because we're feeding it our own geometry. So I'm thinking selecting this entire group, all these in-betweens, not the final output, right-clicking and grouping those nodes. So now they're all grouped. Going inside of that, I actually don't want to output this final op. I want to output just the final geometry. We're going to input geometry and then output geometry. So that's what I want to output. So I'll propagate it. And I don't need this anymore, so I can right click and remove the port. And we'll do the same thing in the beginning. I just need a geometry operation in order to link it. And like I said, don't worry about the specifics. We'll go into way more detail when we have more time. So geometry operation that will feed into here. That's just so I can link from geometry back to this operation stream. So output this, propagate the port, and I don't need this one anymore. Right click and remove. So now we have a operator group that takes in geometry, outputs geometry. Select it, rename it to building 4, and I can copy that and travel back to our other scene file. Pasting it will appear right in the middle of the nodes, and I can take, let's grab, this was the old building 3, so I will just steal its connection and feed it in. So now it's being fed that raw geometry. Now it needs to become part of the operation stream. So I will drag in a geometry op, which will take in geometry. And then I'd like to give it a material. So searching for material, you can see there's a material operation. So let's drag that in. So this final operation will feed into there. This material operation, if I select it, you can see it's got some different parameters and it looks just like your material tag. So I would like to drag in this building texture in the material, and then this can get output as building 4. As soon as it's fed in here, it'll feed to the final scene root. So hopefully, boop, now we see these little buildings filling in the final gaps, and we just built that from scratch, and it's plugged into the rest of the system in a pretty clean way. At any given point, we could go into that geometry, or we can go into this building 4, zoom inside of it and make any change that we like. For instance, I could select the subdivide and subdivide it an extra time. And now that gets subdivided. There's actually 8 polygons initially, and we get smaller buildings. And it's all just adapting to that and applying it everywhere. So really cool, really fun. There is so much potential for this. And I plan on going through this in more detail. And I'm really excited for the future of these nodes as they continue to get added. As I've mentioned, I'm pretty obsessed with the geometry-based ones, but there's a lot of nodes for doing MoGraph type work as well. I think I only went a little bit over my time there. As a reminder, as I said, if you're watching this live, I'm going to be doing a live stream tomorrow with Rick Barrett from Maxon, covering a bunch of the new features. And in a week, I'm going to be doing a live stream with Casey Hupke, all about the scene nodes and the new scene manager. And I'm really looking forward to that one as well. So as I mentioned, there's the new rocketlasso.com. Follow me at Rocket Lasso on all the different platforms. And we've got a plugin in beta right now, so hopefully that will be coming out pretty soon. I can't really talk about it too much, but that should cover everything from me. So thanks for watching.